Hey, this is Chris. I'm hanging with Curtis Armstrong here at New York Comic Con, and you're here for King of the Nerds.
I'm here in part for King of the Nerds, mainly for King of the Nerds, yes.
So I want to ask you, because this is always on our minds. We discuss this all the time. Has the idea of the nerd changed now?
Oh my, well, since Revenge of the Nerds, which was 30 years ago exactly, enormously. I mean, it used to be a derogatory term. It was pejorative that, you were a nerd. It was like you were, all of those words, the geek, spaz, nerd, dork, all of those, it was a way of putting people down. And as is often the case, when you use language to suppress, sometimes that language gets co-opted by the oppressed and turned into a badge of honor, and that's what happened with nerds.
It's strange now because it's kind of like everything that we once loved has become completely mainstream.
Yeah.
And now it's like everybody likes your favorite band. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's an element of that, because what's happened is popular culture, which used to have sort of nerd culture as an adjunct to it, now nerd culture has become so much a part of popular culture that it almost overwhelms everything else. It's like an invasive species, it's like the Great Lakes or something.
We knew it would happen one day.
That's right, and but in a good way, of course. And so what winds up happening is everybody is into gaming, or everybody's into anime, or everybody's into computers, or certain fantasy, science fiction, all of that stuff, which were those were sort of our bread and butter. And now people, one of the great things about the way that nerd culture has changed is that people who would never self-identify as a nerd will find an element of nerd culture, say, just for the sake of argument, fantasy or science fiction books or something like that, or comics, and they would find that, and they would latch on to that because it appeals to the nerd in them.
Right.
And suddenly they realize that nerd culture is not as weird as they maybe thought it was.
Right.
And there's stuff that they can relate to within nerd culture, and before you know it, it takes over everything, and everybody's into nerd culture, which, some nerds feel, that's kind of unfortunate because, but those are the nerds who don't remember what it was like when when there was no access to our tribe.
When you couldn't have a Guardians of the Galaxy movie ever.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could even, I mean, there were odd sort of outliers in the old days, where you would, a movie like Buckaroo Banzai or something would come out, and then everybody would the nerds, these little voices, around the world are going, oh, it's the Buckaroo Banzai movie, and everybody else thought, oh, who'd go to see that? So that kind of thing happens. But the thing that I love about what's happened with nerd culture, that our tribe, when I remember being at the first Star Trek convention in not the first one, but the first one in Detroit, where I grew up.
Which is awesome.
And it was 1973 maybe, or 2, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the idea of a Star Trek convention, and it wasn't called that, it was called something else, but it was incomprehensible. And it was advertised with cast members being there. You could go there to this place and meet members of the cast.
Just mill around.
You could just do well, I mean, it was so exciting. I went down to this thing. I was in college at the time. And I went down to this thing, and there were 3 rooms, not much bigger than this one. I mean, it was basically very small. One room, they were just running 16 millimeter prints of Star Trek episodes. It wasn't in It wasn't in reruns.
Oh,
at
right,
the time, 73. And then there was a sort of hawker's room, but there was basically very little to hawk.
Right.
It wasn't an industry yet. And then the third room, there's James Doohan, George Takei, and Walter Koenig are just standing there. There's no one in the room watching them. They're just sitting at a table. And you could go in there, and there was no line. And you could just go in there. You could spend all afternoon talking to them.
That's awesome.
It was such a strange thing. But there was no access. And because of the internet, because of conventions, that part of the culture, suddenly nerds they know where we all are now.
Right.
You know, everybody knows where everyone is, and that's fantastic.
Do you feel partially, responsible, proud of bringing the culture through Revenge of the Nerds to
I don't think I can.
forefront?
I wouldn't say that, only because it was not like we sat around going, "Here's how we can,
Right.
benefit nerd
Here's
culture.
our plan."
We'll do this movie." It was not a plan per se. I'm happy that it was something that that helped inspire people and moved things along, and it definitely had an influence. But it was not something that was planned ahead of time.
Do you get people coming up to you and saying, "Hey, I felt a lot better about myself after seeing this movie. I felt like I fit in."
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it's part of what contributes to that is the end of the movie. And when we started King of the Nerds, the first season, what I always used to say to our executive producers was, whenever you're in doubt about what we're doing with King of the Nerds, go back and look at the last scene of Revenge of the Nerds, where Bobby Carradine and Anthony Edwards get up in front of the pep rally and say, "I'm a nerd," and they come out as nerds.
Right.
And it's actually kind of a beautiful scene.
Yeah.
And it was what made people in the audience go, "Yes, that's me." And I just think that's part of the whole effect, and we wanted to keep that as part of what we're doing right now, is keep that sense of inclusion and that sense of sticking together and not, there was a serious subtext to the movie,
Right.
in spite of the fact that it was a lot of nudity and nose picking and belching.
And that's fine, because that also, helped people come into their own in other ways.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, and you guys have taken this whole journey the whole time, like 30 years together.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, we and the other nerds and other actors from the film sort of all remained friends after the first movie and the subsequent movies, and so we have stuck together. And Bobby and I, in particular, would socialize. We'd get together every couple of years and have dinner or something. Mm-hmm. And it was over one of those that we came up with the idea of doing a nerd comedy reality show. And it wasn't called King of the Nerds at that point, but that was where it started.
And so what's the response like that been at Comic-Cons like this one?
Well, I mean, it's been growing. I mean, when we were at the first Comic-Con we were at before season one, prior to the airing of season one, but post the filming of episode one, people were there because they were curious, mm-hmm. but they hadn't seen the show, and it was still new, right. and an unknown quantity. And a lot of nerds, frankly, and this was another issue, a lot of nerds felt that this was something that was going to mock nerds in some way, or denigrate them. So, that first one, people were a little hesitant. After the first one, it has grown.
Lines around the block.
Well, I mean, it's been pretty significant. The turnout has been growing all the time. We had a panel yesterday. Mm-hmm. It seems like it was longer ago than that, but we had a panel here, New York Comic Con. Yaya Han was with us, who's been on all 3 episodes so far. We love her, and Kayla, the winner, mm-hmm. from last season, and Xander and Bobby and me, and it was twice the size it had been the year before. Nice. So it's growing and growing and growing, and very gratifying.